Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. Today's episode features guest host Meilin Obinata in her second interview with best-selling author Malcom Harris. Meilin first interviewed Malcom Harris back in July of 2024 about his book Palo Alto, which features the roots of Silicon Valley's tech industry in eugenics, racism, and colonialism at Stanford University in Palo Alto and throughout the state of California. That book ended up being a foreshadowing of what is currently happening at the federal level of the United States as the tech bro oligarchy attempts to take over the U.S. government. In the second book, Malcom Harris writes about climate. The book is called What's Left, and Harris brings forth solutions from the far left, progressive circles, and center-left circles of American society. We always find Malcom Harris to be a thoughtful, well-researched, and very rational thinker and speaker and writer about very important topics in our time. So we hope you enjoy this interview. Please go find our last interview at all of our podcast sites under Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. That's us.
Hi, everybody. This is Meilin Obinata, your host for today. Our guest is Malcom Harris, the best-selling author of Palo Alto. We're going to discuss his new work called What's Left, which is releasing next week. And my understanding is Harris will be visiting Santa Cruz later this month. Malcom Harris, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm really excited to be visiting. That's going to be April 24th at Bookshop Santa Cruz, which I'll be repeating throughout our conversation because I hope to see so many of you there.
We will be very stoked. And where were you born, Malcom Harris?
I was born in Santa Cruz. I'm a child of Santa Cruz. I was born in married student housing, actually. My dad was an undergrad at Santa Cruz when I was born.
Okay, did everybody hear that? You have to show up. He was actually born right here in the bosom of Santa Cruz. All right. So, Malcom Harris, thank you so much for coming back to KSQD. You were kind enough to speak with us last summer and to discuss Palo Alto. And I guess you were in like such a good mood that you wrote this book about how we're going to solve the climate change crisis. So just like really easily. So I'm just curious when you started writing the book, because I would say reading Palo Alto, it kind of seems like you foretold the future. So I'm just wondering, is that how you feel about this book as well?
Well, I sure hope so. This is like a set of possible futures, I guess. I started writing it pretty soon after I finished the last one, so a couple of years ago, maybe even like 2 years exactly, let's say, because you got to keep writing the books or they don't keep paying you. That's the problem with being an author.
Okay. Wow. I guess that's what it means to work for a living. So,
right, it's a bummer.
That's kind of a bummer. You have to keep showing up, otherwise nothing happens to your bank account. So when I was reading your book and trying to grapple with like the structure of it, there are a couple things that really stood out. One is I don't have a lot of experience reading political science books. However, it was extremely readable and enjoyable. I actually told a friend earlier today, it made me fall back in love with reading because you punctuate. I'm just going to give you some praise right now. It's not really a question, but there's just such beauty in the book with your references, which are not only factual and historical and analytical and so on, but you drawing from film, drawing from the world of art. I thought that was a very interesting way to make a book, and I'm just curious if you'd like to talk a little bit about that painting with the man whose back is to the viewer. Why would you include that in a work like this?
Yeah, there's a lot of artistic references in the book, and honestly, that's part of how I think. And that's how I was going to bring the reader into my patterns of thought. And that's the best way I know how, is sort of bring them in through examples, but not just examples of like people doing things or concrete examples in the world, but also artistic examples. I think that's how people, at our best, how people think about the world and make sense of the world, right? We don't just make sense of the world through news items. We also make sense of it through poetry and through painting, and through films and through like stupid TV shows. And I've got a fair amount of, I guess, all of that in there, I think. And I feel like that's a way to bring things to the level and meet readers where they are, rather than just try to make it like as professional as possible or not even touch these other forms of expression. I think there's a lot to learn from them as well. I think it hopefully makes the book a lot stronger and a lot easier to read for sure.
Yeah, Mary Poppins says a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. I'm not saying that the rest of the book is medicine, but just it's difficult to layer intellectual content with accessibility and immediacy. So yeah, I would just say some aspects of the book, it made me think about what I've heard from filmmakers like Spike Lee or Werner Herzog or David Lynch. All three of them, I think, have said at some point, if you want to make a film, you get a bunch of index cards and you just, write your images. And then when you have like about 100 of them, then you have a movie. And I'm sure that you had more than 70 or 100 index cards when you started writing this. But at what point did you realize, actually can make a book about this idea?
It was actually pretty fully formed. It's funny, the way I sold it was not the way I planned to sell my next book or write my next book or pitch my next book. I had a meeting scheduled with my agent about an entirely different project where I had written the outline, I'd written some sample material, I had bought books, research material, which I really try not to do because I'm very superstitious and I can jinx myself. And this is an example of that. And the night before our meeting, I had a dream, and I don't even remember the content of the dream, but I woke up with this idea, this phrase, oil is life, and this idea that I had to describe the climate crisis as a failure of life in capitalism in the way that I do. And then I pitched that to my agent the next day, and he said, yeah, let's do that. That sounds good. And so then I had to write the outline and sell the book, write the introduction, and do all that work. But from the beginning, it was a book project that sort of attacked me. I feel like I didn't plan to write the book. The idea for this book grabbed me out of my unconscious, which has not happened to me before. It was a surprising experience. And I don't mean to suggest that that's why people should read the book, because it's not, inspired divinely or something like that. It just happened to come to me in a dream, very strangely.
I actually think that would do very well within our broadcast area, which encompasses Monterey County and Santa Cruz County. I think we're all about the dreaming life. Okay.
The dream world. Well,
the dream world, yeah.
Yeah. The unconscious does a lot of work when you're not paying attention. So it was working on me. The ideas were working on me before I was working on them.
So you not only do you write books, but you also write articles and comment on current events. I'm just curious if you wanted to say anything about the events this weekend from all the protests, and there were different ones, but how should we understand those protests within the structure of your book?
That's a great question. I was out there. I mean, I live in Philadelphia these days, so I was out there with my wife and 1-year-old child. We were walking in the crowd. We were in fact in the peace delegation of the march, which was fighting for an end to the war in Gaza. And that was not necessarily one of the headline topics for the march as far as organizers were concerned, it seemed like. But that didn't mean that people out there weren't also supportive of an end to the war and to the genocide, which is clearly the most important cause we can march for these days, no matter what Trump is doing. But I think in terms of what does the march represent for the left, I think it's a lot of opportunity. I think there are a lot of people out there who want to make a difference, who are outraged at what's going on, and not just outraged at the Republicans, but also outraged at the Democrats, and realize that there's something else that we have to do, and are ready to go out and take responsibility for their part in that. And it's hard to find political leadership these days. And so in some ways, I feel like those marches are an answer to the problematic that I'm talking about, but it's also the problem that I'm talking about, which is that we have some of this energy and it's not very coherent strategically, and we don't necessarily have a vision of like what we want to happen.
You mentioned, now that you're talking about the disappointment with the Democratic Party, you suggest that workers should break up with the Democratic Party and form a third one that will actually accumulate power. How have people received that, a suggestion?
Well, to be fair, it's not my suggestion. I'm quoting Kim Moody, who's the founder of Labor Notes and an author and influential thinker on the left. So I think that's definitely one of the perspectives within the strategy of public power that I describe in the book. One of the ideas is that we need a labor party. And I think a lot of people take that perspective, that the Democratic Party fundamentally is just not a labor party. It's never been a labor party. It's a party in which labor is an interest group, but it does not represent the interests of labor, and we're never going to be able to represent ourselves within the political system through such a vehicle, and we're going to need a new party. A lot of people believe that line pretty consistently. I think there's some strength to it. I think there are a fair amount of counter arguments, so I'm not like a partisan for a Labor Party. That said, if anyone was to start one that seemed viable or interesting, I can't say I wouldn't be excited or wouldn't switch my party affiliation that I was suckered into registering for Bernie and back in the day. So I'm not a like we need political independence from the Democratic Party guy necessarily, but I'm open to that argument, and it's one I definitely explore in the book.
Thank you. So one of the, I guess, the things that sort of captured me was the fact that you are employing this very direct structure. You tell the reader, hey, I'm going to tell you some of the pros and the cons for each of these ways of engaging in political collective action. And I was actually really stressed out when I started reading your book. I was a little depressed, actually, because I was overwhelmed because you're laying out a structure. It's like learning about, I don't know, algebra. Like, here's the commutative property, here's the transitive property. Like, this is how numbers work. Does everybody understands? Here's like the x-axis, the y-axis. This is just, here are the mechanics of collective action. Here are the mechanics of how we do things. And it was terrifying, actually, to see instincts. Like, there's instincts that we have, and you just lay them bare. And after a while, I thought, oh, actually, this is very relaxing, because you have all this evidence, and I realized I'm relieved of all the gaslighting that typically would go on in talking about the way things work. And so I just wanted to share that with you, which I think means that I think any piece of art or creativity, or I guess in the case of your book, nonfiction, if it has an impact on a reader, I would say that is a successful piece of writing. You mentioned that the government structures that we're dealing with today are largely the ones formed in the time of World War I, which were oriented towards fossil fuel oligarchic wishes. And when I read that, I thought, oh, well, that does explain a lot. Mm-hmm. So that was a moment of just such great relief. Like, oh, okay. Like, oh yeah, this is like, it's kind of like, oh, how do you get to grandma's house? Like, oh, you go past the tree with the flamingo, and then you make a turn, and it's like, oh yeah, oh, what are you saying? So when why is there so much work involved in making sure we don't understand that? We say, as Americans, why is there so much invested in making sure we don't know these things? We don't understand that that's how these structures work.
Yeah, I'm not sure if knowing how things work necessarily changes them. I don't think it does it automatically, right? I think a lot of people do know on some level how things work in this country and in the world, right? And if you ask people like, oh, where did your sneakers come from? Like, who do you think made your sneakers? I think a lot of people would be able to tell you, like, basically the like structure of global economic exploitation that underlies all of their consumption or whatever. So I don't think it's ignorance that's really stopping people. But at the same time, presenting the mechanics as something, saying it out loud, the mechanics of capitalist society and what that means and how we are compelled to act by this impersonal system that does not care about us and yet seems to care about exploiting us every day. I think talking about that and bringing it out into the open is threatening to that system. I think everyone knows that on some level as well. And people avoid doing it. A lot of people avoid talking about it because they know on some level that they'll face consequences, that they'll get in trouble. I've been throughout my entire life, very bad at knowing that, at like ingesting that information of like, oh, you're not supposed to talk about that really, or like, because it's true. And I think like the truth is, whether it's going to set you free or not, you should at least say it. And you only live once, and why say anything else? But how do you present the truth in a way that people find accessible, or people find like they can understand or make sense of or put to work is like tough. It's a full-time gig, and there's not a lot of demand out there from the capitalist economic world for that kind of work. It is suppressed within our society. I think there's a lot of it because a lot of people take their independent time, energy, resources, brain power, and devote it toward trying to explain this as best they can. But they're fighting an uphill battle. We all are, to a certain degree. And I've been really lucky to get to do this as a full-time job and get to really put the work in to try and think about how do I present this argument about things that I do think people do know. I think people know a lot of this stuff already, but to put it in a way that they will experience as revelatory, revealing something that they already know. That feeling that you're kind of talking about is sort of realizing something that you already know. And yeah, that's totally what I'm aiming for.
We were just talking about how no one's going to pay you to say that the emperor has no clothes. And that's with Malcolm Harris, who is just about to release his new book, What's Left. He'll be visiting Santa Cruz later this month, and you can set your eyes directly on this great author.
That's the 24th at the Bookshop Santa Cruz.
Thank you, Malcolm Harris. So some of what struck me in this book is that there are lessons, both economic and ecological, from COVID. So having various governments pump billions and billions of various forms of currency in the time of COVID, and seeing what happens or what can happen when we shut things down, was that part of your analysis and kind of figuring out how do you want to present these structures of all these governments and these different options for collective action?
I think COVID was definitely a revelatory moment for a lot of people, both in this country and around the world, about what happens when something really does happen, right? We have this idea that nothing important really happens, that history's over, et cetera, et cetera. And COVID really, really broke that. I mean, some people held on to the idea that COVID was not happening and did not happen and it's not still happening. But I think a lot of people really had to reconcile themselves to something major happening in the world and our structures revealing themselves as chosen and as like operated by people, that they weren't automatic and we were going to have to make collective choices. And the economic logic through which the United States, the ruling parties of the United States have operated for a long time was thrown up into the air. I mean, I remember really early in COVID, you had Mitt Romney went on TV or whatever and said, yeah, well, you know, every household should probably get a check every month for, I don't know, what, like $5,000? And that was crazy that someone, never mind a Republican or whatever, but just that a national politician was saying like, oh yeah, well, we should think about what it would take to make sure every household in the country has the access to the things they need, because they might not be able to access it through their job, because jobs are, you know, so chaotic or so hard to come by right now, and you can't guarantee that kind of thing. And we got to make sure everyone has what they need. So why don't we just send everybody checks? Why don't we figure that out? And they suppressed that instinct, you know, pretty quickly and reduced those promises and made them conditional. But it was still the largest act of that kind of social insurance, emergency social insurance, that we've seen in this country in my lifetime, for sure. And I think that did open up people's imagination a little bit. It also has incurred a kind of backlash, and I think we should be attentive to the machinations in the sort of center liberal think tank world about changing the conversation right now away from the insights of that moment back towards orthodox economics and like permitting reform as the horizon of our politics or something. We should understand that as a kind of backlash to the openness of that moment.
Just by the way, on this show, Talk of the Bay, and it was a crossover with Moment of Truth, I interviewed, and other hosts interviewed, people in to talk about Grants Pass versus Johnson. So when I saw you mentioning anti-camping laws, of course, it was interesting to see how you framed it in the context of labor seeking opportunities for capitalism to exploit that labor. And throughout the book, you talk about cheap nature and cheap labor. So when you were just speaking like 30 seconds ago about keeping a memory of the lessons from COVID and kind of keeping watch over the backlash for these, say, centrist moves and so on, how do those fit in the context of the structure of your book? Of course, I'm going to make every question connect back to the structure of your book.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm here to promote. It's
awesome.
And dance, you know? Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things I write about is that like squats and encampments like that. First of all, I've written about the turn towards encampments among unhoused folks for years before this book, and engaged in encampment defense activism, and it's something I think is really important, and something that I wrote about in my first book, that we should expect these kind of things to happen. And we should expect these encampments to emerge. So it wasn't something that you couldn't see coming. You could definitely see it coming. And I think it's been an interesting locus for reaction against these camps as a way to pull liberals to the right, you know, pull the center to the right against the unhoused, and especially against the like collective organization of the unhoused in their own interest, which is really what encampments are. Encampments are homeless people making themselves safer than they would be otherwise. And we need to understand it that way. And one of the things I write about in the book is that the people sort of on the center left need to get over their feelings of panic around disorder. And like when they see homeless people, they like get politically scared. And they need to, if they're serious about even addressing the climate crisis, right, that they need to get over those feelings of panic around disorder and start thinking about how they can integrate their political activity into the political activity of people who are forming these encampments. And that might not mean like supporting the encampments or even like, you know, even dropping off food or something, which they should do. But thinking about using this as a lever to try and advocate for more low-income housing or advocate for eviction moratoria, which is one of the big lessons, I think, from COVID, and one of the big reactions from the capitalist class was really fear about what something like an eviction moratoria could mean. Not even just like the consequences of the moratorium itself on being unable to evict people, but the idea that the state and the public could impose such a restriction on the owners of all of these apartments and houses and buildings, et cetera, that the public could decide you're not allowed to kick people out. Like, that's a pretty profound piece of political change that they were really excited to brush under the rug. And I think we need to bring it out from under the rug.
It pains me to tell you that in beautiful Santa Cruz, your birthplace, that the local electeds' politics of the moment include passing laws to restrict the parking of recreational vehicles in certain areas, and that has caused quite a bit of turmoil and for people who were living in those. And of course, we see in the city of Fremont and other California cities and other parts of the West Coast, this embrace of Grants Pass versus Johnson. Mm-hmm. I feel terribly about it, but I'm extra sad that we were seeing that sort of fear in Santa Cruz even before the Supreme Court decided to make it illegal to sleep outside. So thank you for that.
Well, and it's just so contrary to the spirit of Santa Cruz and the area. As far as I know it, the idea that, that people don't have the right to sleep outside is like fundamentally outrageous, I think. And we need to say that it's fundamentally outrageous.
Well, I mean, going from that light topic, I wanted to ask you about another really light topic, which is, why do capitalists just love to keep killing women farmers? Why do they keep doing it? What is it? I think it's really interesting to think about the fight against, say, capitalism and the scars of colonialism as femicide. So I'd love to hear you expand on that.
Yeah, I read about it's a really important conference on feminicide, which is what they call it, where they talk about women land defenders and water defenders throughout the world as the front lines of these conflicts, and that the history of women's roles within so many societies of reproduction, which includes care for the land and farming and agriculture, has put them on the front lines with extraction projects, with dams, with threats to the ecological systems, especially within indigenous and peasant communities, which is where so many of these so-called resources are located, are within the same ecological space as existing indigenous communities, way more than people would imagine. And these conflicts have absolutely acquired and have had for a while, I would say, a gender dynamic where the leadership of the land protection and water protection is disproportionately women. And the companies that are doing this work, and in official political representation as well as unofficial political representation within community leaders, within tribal structures, and within officially elected liberal political structures. This happens at all levels. And one of the ways that these projects and the companies behind them have found to smooth the way for what they do is to kill people, to assassinate political leaders. And it's something we need to understand both as a injustice in the world and as a structural element to the mechanics of the system we're fighting against.
Why is it that capitalists have to engage in femicide? Because women have been on the front lines of defending water and nature and land and I guess they're just the collateral damage. So what's interesting, that particular aspect of, say, the violence associated with capitalism, I thought was really interesting, because so much of what I hear about violence against women, a lot of it is framed, say, in a domestic context, or sometimes it might be painted in some as limited to certain industries. For example, in the poultry processing or meat processing industry, or even agricultural industry, there's a film called Rape in the Fields, which shows the vulnerability of women workers who are undocumented, who receive the predation of, say, their male supervisors, and without the protection of authorities are subject to these things. But understanding that maybe the greatest threat to women thriving is when they stand up to violent forces in their communities. So thank you for having that in your book. One of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that I just learned a lot of concepts and ideas. For example, I'd love for you to explain, what is the Jevons paradox? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, the Jevons paradox, it actually got a lot of pop attention lately with the conversation about AI build out and the DeepSeek model. When they released the DeepSeek model, people were hoping that the Jevons paradox would actually mean that this meant more demand for computing power rather than less. Because what the Jevons paradox is about coal consumption originally. And the idea was, it's William Stanley Jevons, I believe, is the economist who first suggested it. And an industrial revolution era concept, and it's that the increasing efficiency of coal-fired engines wouldn't lead to a reduction in the consumption of coal. It was actually leading to an increase in the consumption of coal, because it made the consumption of coal more profitable, because you could get more done with a smaller amount of coal, which actually led to the consumption overall of more coal. And one of the examples that I use in the book is a study about whales, and whale extinction didn't stop. The path towards whale extinction didn't stop with the substitution of fossil fuels for whale oil in terms of like lamp lighting and stuff, because actually fossil fuels made it really easy, a lot easier to kill whales. And so actually it led to killing way more whales way faster and making cheaper whale oil. So this idea that we can increase the efficiency and thereby control our consumption runs into this paradox within capitalist society, that actually if you increase efficiency, there's a danger of your increasing consumption as well because of that efficiency.
I wanted to read from your book something that I thought was, I guess, very harmonizing or calming, perhaps. Partisans cannot blame a successful path towards a better world on their own, outside the context of a larger left-wing strategy of strategies. Public power needs the radical threat. Communists need bail money. Market craft needs an organized working-class constituency, and so on. So I think I really appreciated you having that there to help people understand it's not helpful to fight amongst ourselves as having the monopoly on a good idea. Was that your goal?
Originally, I was going to write about why I was right and everyone else was wrong. And how my strategy was the only strategy, and how all the other strategies were doomed to fail analytically. And then I sort of thought about the analytical challenge that we're facing, and I had to admit that no, there are other strategies that that are analytically viable about going through the climate crisis. And so it was incumbent on me both to explore those and really think through their strongest arguments, which is what I try and do in this book, and not in a way where I'm trying to refute them or seeking to demonstrate that they're ultimately not true, but to really understand everyone on their own terms. And for me, that's ultimately a question of realism, of being realistic, because in the time scale that we're operating on, which is pretty tight, right? We're talking about like decades, not centuries, if we're lucky. The idea that we're going to like all convince that anyone's going to convince everybody else on the left that they should abandon their strategic perspective for a different one, like that'll happen with some people, and we'll see some strategies, acquire more or lose more adherence over time in different places and such like that. But the idea that we're going to have everyone jump behind one strategy in advance of their victory or whatever, it doesn't seem plausible to me. It doesn't seem like a thing that's going to happen. I don't think I'm going to be convinced. And I don't think people, we're talking about, in some cases, people's whole life world, right? That they should like be convinced to abandon because someone makes a good argument about how we're going to use policy to address the climate crisis or something. I don't think that's going to happen. And so to be realistic is to acknowledge that people are going to be operating under different strategic models during the period we're talking about, during the period that matters. And for me to produce something useful, it has to operate on that field, the field of reality. We can't be too realistic. If we're too realistic, we, as Mike Davis says, and I quote in the book, there's a danger that we turn to stone and feel like we can't do anything at all because the situation is so bad. So we can't be so realistic that we find it paralyzing. But we need to be realistic about the situation in which we find ourselves. And part of that realism is like looking around and at the people around us and what they're thinking and why they're thinking it.
Thank you. And going back to the way in which you organized the book, I think that just laying out the different strategies, that was, I think I mentioned early at the top of the hour, that was extremely clarifying for me to understand what has worked, right? And then what you're talking about just now, the realism of embracing these strategies. I think people do spend a lot of time trying to say what is left or what is not. What does it mean to be on the left? And I'm just wondering, what does it mean to be politically left in the U.S.? I know that's unfair of me to ask you, but earlier you were talking about the center left sort of recoiling from certain lessons of COVID economically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this project has been really clarifying for me on that question. And I think it's a really good one, and it's definitely one that I allude to in the title. I guess it's a sort of pun title about what's left to do and what is on the left, what's politically left. And the conclusion that I come to, which is also really the premise for this text, is that the left begins when we agree or accept that the social planning prerogative belongs to society itself and not to a subset of that society, not to a class, the capitalist class in particular, within that society, but that society gets to plan for itself on its own behalf. And the mechanisms for how to do that, maybe it's market policy and market craft, and that's one of the strategies that I talk about, is how do you shape a market to do what you want it to do as a society. Or maybe it's the society taking hold of those resources itself, or maybe it's changing the whole basis on which we organize society in the first place. But you have to accept that it's our prerogative. There is not a market that pre-exists our choices to which we must try and conform. This is up to us.
Thank you. We have a caller with a question. The question is, what can we do under the Trump administration about climate? And I'm looking at your page 260, but since that's towards the end of the book, I don't want to spoil towards the end, so I'll let you answer that question.
Well, then I'll spoil it.
Okay.
Because the end is what I suggest is that we really need to start exercising leadership around disaster preparation, preparedness, and defense within our communities. Because the state is failing us on this question, civil society is failing us on this question, and that's one of the few places that I think in this moment that the left is able to exercise leadership and really build power is like, how are we ready for what we know is going to happen, whether it's floods, fires, storms, pandemics. Like, we know these things are happening. We know what kinds of things are going to happen around where we live, or we are able to find out or figure it out or ask people or research or study. And so I think that's a place where the left can step up, and all parts of the left. I think that's something that we can cohere around, is this question of, how do we get ready for the disasters that we know are going to characterize this century? You know, whether it's disastrous or not, we know it's going to be disasterful. And so those disasters are going to organize our society, whether we like it or not. And the left needs to start exercising leadership about how we are going to respond to that, how we're going to organize ourselves in response to being organized by a disaster.
Malcolm, you were just talking about the importance of disaster councils and how all parts of the left can cohere around it. And I would just say, in the broadcast era, we have the very large lithium battery storage facility fire in Moss Landing. A few years back, we had the CZU fires affecting the Santa Cruz Mountains. And the flooding we experience in Pajaro, these are all, in one way or another, they're all tied to climate change. So when I read your book, I thought, right, because since we're spoiling, there's aspects of the books in which you're talking about these dancing pairs of ideas of kind of how we as humans and our food systems and so on, we are extracting things from nature, and nature will fight back in different ways. So I thought your book could not possibly be more timely. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you, or maybe draw attention to things that seemed so resonant to me as someone in this area. We experience saltwater intrusion because of the need to draw fresh water. We have significant agriculture in this area. And you also address, or you mention, what happens in the Corn Belt, the extraction of topsoil, and both of those things, extracting fresh water within California and the beautiful topsoil of the Corn Belt. Those are things that we might not associate with climate change. Could you expand on those things?
Yeah, the truth is that the climate change is interrelated with our ecological systems at all levels, period. And if you look at like the Moss Landing fire, right? That's a battery plant that's specifically devoted to the green energy transition, which itself is a response to climate change. And so climate change isn't just like affecting our soil because the temperature is changing or whatever. It's affecting what we are producing, which itself is characterizing our environment. And these are things that we can know about, right? They're things that we can prepare, and we can try to make decisions collectively about what kind of things do we want where we live, and what do we need as a larger system in order to provide people with the things that they need. And that's a tough balancing act, right? I can't say that there's like a automatic heuristic we can use for these projects are good and worthwhile and worth potential environmental damage, and these ones aren't. I think what we need to do is rely on knowledge of people who have like really, really granular knowledge about the places where they live. And in places where that knowledge has been systematically destroyed, we need to build it again. And that's one of the tasks that I think about in terms of these disaster councils, is not just acting, not just responding, but also studying and building knowledge about like, okay, what's likely to happen in our community, and what's likely to happen if we do things that we haven't even thought about yet, or things that are projects that are being proposed or whatever. I find the idea that we need to spend less time doing environmental impact studies pretty alarming. I think we need to spend a lot of time and energy doing environmental impact studies now more than ever. So Again, these things are knowable. Like, we can learn them and we can make decisions collectively. And that's really our only choice in this moment, even though even getting to that is going to be a struggle, right? I'm not sanguine. I don't pretend that it's easy, but it's a struggle that we have to take on.
Early on in the book, you refer to, I think it's actually in the first few pages, but you refer to fossil fuel industries and related industries being in the business of not exactly knowing and not identifying certain problems. I was just thinking about that because you talked about the fact that we're capable of knowing what happens to the environment and so on. So why is there such an emphasis in making sure that we don't measure too carefully, that there's certain things we just don't know?
There's among proponents of capitalism, there's this idea that it knows everything, right? That the market knows all facts and automatically generates that knowledge and evaluates it through stock prices. And one of the ways we can tell that this isn't true is because companies, fossil fuel companies in particular that I talk about, will choose what things to know about themselves and what things not to know about themselves. And fossil fuel companies have pretty consistently chosen not to know inconvenient facts about their own emissions, which is, why would you produce that if you want? Why would you produce inconvenient numbers about your downstream emissions or whatever? Why wouldn't you just produce the most convenient numbers about your emissions profile? So if you're an oil company, you don't want to actually include the emissions of the people who are using your oil and like burning it to power things, for which is the only purpose they're buying this oil for. You just want to include the emissions that come from extracting the oil. And then you can talk about like, this is a low emission mode of extraction for oil, which is nuts, but that's what they do. And they do it very intentionally. But our interests are not those interests, right? We really need to know as much as we can about this stuff, whether it's good or bad, especially if it's bad, right? We need to know as much information as we can use. And these companies that are in charge of planning our society right now are in the way. They're preventing us from knowing things about them.
It reminds me a bit about the historical figures in your book, Palo Alto, who were very invested in conveniently forgetting their histories when looking back at, say, business history, when many of these businesses say, we were the first, right? Or we're the only, and having that, the convenient context of being the first means if anyone tried it before, you don't have to say that you failed because you never tried it before. And so it's this concept of forgetting and not knowing. Those concepts seem very, I would say, they seem like cousins. So maybe these people in the realm of the Palo Alto book, they took cues from the fossil fuel capitalists. Thank you for also writing Palo Alto. Okay, so
I do my best. Like I said, I got to do it to keep getting paid.
You got to keep, yeah. So I'm just curious, since we talked about farming, one of your examples was bokashi, and could you explain what that is and why that is something that would not catch fire, so to speak, in the context of capitalism?
Maybe K-Squid listeners might actually know what this is. I feel like the lines are about to blow up, right? People are going to be like, oh, I know about bokashi.
Maybe.
It's a active composting recipe technique, sure, that was codified by a Japanese scientist in the 80s that involves using microbes to break down food waste to compost it quicker, like by adding microbes intentionally as opposed to just relying on microbes in the soil to sort of do the work. So it's a very intentional composting process that gets to the root of what's going on in compost, and sort of you can do it on your counter is one of the reasons people like it. And this is a pretty amazing technology when we think of the history of technological development or whatever. This is huge, and we don't think about it that way because it's not particularly profitable. There's not a whole lot of money in bokashi composting, either at the consumer level or at the industrial level, even though it could be like hugely, hugely useful in terms of reducing waste and getting better gardening yields and all sorts of things. And peasant communities throughout the world, indigenous and peasant communities, for whom this is very, very useful technology, have spread it among themselves since its codification around the world. And it's sort of a technology from below that humanity itself can make like really amazing use of if it weren't being sort of suppressed by the interests of capitalist agriculture as it's practiced today. And I think there are a lot of examples of technology like that and more technologies like that to come to find in our world. And so when we think about like technological advancement or technological abundance, we shouldn't just think about it in capitalist terms. We should think about all sorts of technologies from below that are going to be crucial in actually adapting to and overcoming the planetary crisis as we're experiencing it now.
Thank you. And as we go into our last 5 minutes, I'm just wondering, why were you so honest about the downsides of, I think it was communism? You were saying communists, some of the communists are rejecting booze and romance. And so I'm just curious why didn't you try to glamorize like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much fun. You could have your bokashi compost pile and like, I don't know what else, but like, why not?
I mean, I think I do some of that too, right? Well, I was trying to be very fair with how I looked at each of these strategies, though, as you might know, I myself am a communist. I'm a communist partisan. But I wanted to go through all of the strategies and be pretty rigorous about giving everyone a fair shake structurally, both because I think that's like rhetorically compelling. I think the point of the book wasn't to find the correct answer and how everyone else was wrong or whatever. And so in those 3 body paragraph chapters where I'm going through and looking at the different strategies, each one of them gets 5 positive sections and 3 negative sections. And I didn't have any trouble finding positive sections or negative sections for any of the strategies, right? Like no one's perfect. They really are puzzle pieces. And there are problems to being a communist. Like we can't pretend that there aren't. There are big problems with being a communist everywhere in the world. Maybe the biggest is that like we're pretty unpopular and we don't have any like resources or land or money, and our enemies are willing to just kill us, and like that's a big deal.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. Wow, you're really selling it now.
I know, right? It's like,
yeah,
really selling it. But I think I don't think lying or sugarcoating or whatever is ultimately a way to convince people, because I think people are pretty smart. And I think, not to get into anybody else's book right now or whatever, but the sort of abundance line that we're hearing from another bestseller these days is sort of that kind of rhetorical attempt to simplify, to even make things simplistic, to try and convince people that they don't need to think that much. And I don't think that's true. I think people need to like think a lot about all of these questions, and I don't want to lie to them. And I think they can do it. And I think we can do it together. But I think it's hard work and it's scary and dangerous and we might lose. And lying about any of that is not going to be effective. If I do one thing, it's that I tell my readers the truth, as I understand it.
Thank you, Malcolm Harris. Is there anything I didn't ask you yet? And I think this is like our last minute together.
What is the date and location of my Santa Cruz event for anyone who's just turned in?
Yeah, I believe you will be at the Bookshop Santa Cruz April 24th.
That is correct. And I believe it's 7 to 8 p.m.
Wow. Very granular. Yeah.
I hope to see K-Squid listeners. And if you're a K-Squid listener who comes to Bookshop Santa Cruz to come check out the book or ask a question that you didn't get a chance to today, make sure to tell me. Give K-Squid the shout out.
Thank you, Malcolm Harris. So your book drops, I believe, next Tuesday, the 15th. tax day. I hear the engineer giving me the outro music, so that's my cue to say I've been your host, Meilin Obinata, with our special guest, Malcom Harris, whose new book, What's Left, is something that he'll be talking about when he visits Santa Cruz on the 24th. He is the best-selling author of the book Palo Alto, which told us about what was going to happen when the Silicon Valley oligarchy.
They know. The listeners know.
Everybody's like, why are you writing this book? And then it's like, the proof is in the pudding. Yeah, that's why Malcolm Harris wrote that book. Yes, so he's the guy who tells the future.
Thank you all. Hope to be back.
Thanks, everybody. I'd like to thank Howard Feldstein, Program Manager, Amy Chen Mills, Troy Schendeldecker, Nyako Nyasu, and everyone else at KSQD for their passionate volunteering and hard work.
Malcom Harris will be speaking at the Bookshop Santa Cruz right here in Santa Cruz, California on Thursday, April 24th at 7 p.m. That's a free event, and we highly encourage you to go out and listen after you listen to this podcast. Also, go back to our last interview with Malcom Harris, which you can find at all your favorite podcast sites under this podcast, Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. And please like, review, subscribe, and comment. That helps us get the word out, and we appreciate it immensely.